The final week of October in the year 1893 brought with it the kind of persistent damp that creeps into a man's joints and never quite lets go. London, always gray at the edges, now seemed entirely forged of slate and smoke. Cold wind stirred the yellowed leaves along Baker Street, where they gathered in melancholy drifts outside shuttered shops and pub doors. The scent of coal fires hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faintly sour aroma of rain-soaked horse dung in the steely tank of the Thames. Chapter 1. I had risen late that morning, an unusual indulgence, as my practice in Queensgate had been quiet of late, with no greater ailments than the occasional case of bronchitis or rheumatism. The war years had taught me to seize my rest where I could find it, and so, with a rare freedom from urgent calls, I found myself climbing the familiar 17 steps 221B shortly after the stroke of 10, to my mild surprise. Holmes had flung the windows open, despite the chill. A gust of wind surged into the room and toyed with the edges of his scattered papers. He sat cross-legged on the floor in his dressing gown, his violin lying inert beside him like a discarded confidant. The fire in the grate had burned down too, a sleepy glow, and a blue haze of Turkish tobacco spiraled ceilingward from the long-stemmed pipe in his left hand. "Good heavens, Holmes," I said as I entered, rubbing my gloved hands together for warmth. "At least shut the windows before we freeze to death." He glanced up, and I was instantly struck by the intensity of his gaze. Though his features bore the pallor of a man who had slept little, his eyes were bright with that unmistakable firewatt I called, in my own thoughts, the signal flare of genius. He ignored my protest entirely. "I presume," he said, as though continuing a conversation already begun, "that your patient at Queen's Gate has recovered sufficiently to dispense with your services for the day." "How the devil," I began, then stopped short. "Yes, Mr. Emery's fever broke 2 nights ago. How could you possibly? There's a red smear of carbolic liniment on your right cuff, and a copy of the British Medical Journal protrudes from your overcoat. Pocketjet, you are not presently on your rounds. Conclusion, you have no urgent engagements and decided, as ever, to pay a visit to your increasingly erratic friend." He gave a ghost of a smile, then reached behind him to retrieve a folded piece of cream-colored parchment. "You are just in time, Watson. We ought to have a caller, a client." He shook his head. "Not precisely. This arrived by courier not 20 minutes ago." He handed me the letter without further comment. The seal was unremarkable, but the handwriting within was of such refined elegance that I immediately pictured a woman of some education and breeding. It read, "Mr. Holmes, forgive the sudden nature of this request. I am aware that your reputation precedes you, and that you are not one to indulge in the sentimental. And yet, it is precisely sentiment and the shadow it casts that brings me to your door. There has been no crime, no theft, no act of violence to prosecute, and yet something is wrong, deeply wrong. I cannot say more in a letter. I will arrive at 11 o'clock this morning. I pray you will see me. Respectfully, Lady Brackwelly looked up. No crime. Then why? Because, Holmes said, rising fluidly to his feet, the absence of crime is sometimes the most sinister element of all. There is something implied in her phrasing sentiment, in the shadow it casts, which tells me we are not dealing with an ordinary domestic trifle. Lady Brackwell. The name was not unfamiliar to me. She is the widow of Sir Percival Brackwell, is she not? The industrialist who perished in a hunting accident last spring. The very one, Holmes said, pacing toward the hearth and tossing a few small logs onto the fire. Shot through the heart at point-blank range, if I recall. The case was deemed accidental by the local authorities in Derbyshire. No inquest. And yet, she seeks you out months later, and without accusation. I frowned. What could she want? Gadap, Holmes said, tapping ash from his pipe into the grate. is what I intend to discover. At precisely 11 o'clock, a handsome cab pulled up in front of the building, and a figure in dark morning attire emerged beneath a black umbrella. A moment later, the sharp knock of the door knocker echoed up the stairwell. Mrs. Hudson, brisk and bustling as ever despite her stiff knees, ushered the lady into our sitting room. Lady Brackwell was tall and composed, though the lines around her eyes betrayed a sleeplessness she could not conceal. She wore no jewelry, save for a single jet brooch pinned at her collar. Her gloved hands were clasped tightly, the knuckles. "Pale, Mr. Holmes," she began as she took her seat. "I must confess, I feel quite mad coming here." "You are not mad, Lady Brackwell," Holmes said gently. "Only disturbed by something you cannot name. Thea is often the beginning of clarity." Her eyes filled with sudden tears, though she blinked them away. "My late husband kept an estate in Derbyshire Gramere Hall. It has been in the Brackwell family for 3 generations. Since his death, I've tried to carry on as best I could, but there is something I cannot dismiss." Holmes leaned forward. "Take your time, my lady. Speak freely." She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and produced a photograph, old and creased. It depicted a man in hunting gear, standing beside a large hound in front of a heavy wooden door. His face bore a distinct resemblance to portraits I had seen of Sir Percival, but what caught my eye was the background. "That photograph was taken in 1861, she said. "Shows Percival's father, Reginald Brackwell, outside the attic door of Gramere Hall. A curious place to pose, wouldn't you say?" Holmes studied the image intently. "What is behind that door now?" She hesitated. "It had been locked for as long as I can remember. Servants say it was never used. I had no reason to question it until 3 weeks ago, when I began to hear sounds, footsteps. At night, soft, deliberate, and sometimes voices whispering. I thought it grief at first, but then I found this." She reached again into her bag and drew out a small oil painting no larger than a notebook. It was wrapped in brown paper. I carefully removed the covering and held it up. It depicted the same door, but this time it was ajar and a single pale hand emerged from the darkness behind it. "I found it lying on the attic stairs," Lady Brackwell said, her voice tight. "No one claims to have painted it. No one admits to placing it there, in the attic door. It is still locked." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Danged. Then he stood and turned back toward the fireplace, as though warming his thoughts more than his hands. "You say there has been no crime," he said softly. "Yet a locked room, phantom footsteps, it's in a painting. No one admits to. These are the bones of a story that wants to become criminal." He turned back toward her, eyes gleaming. "Lady Brackwell, I believe we shall pay Gramere Hall a visit, okay? We leave by evening train." The journey northward that evening was cloaked in a kind of moody silence I had come to associate with Holmes in the early stages of an intriguing problem. He sat opposite me in the first-class compartment, his long legs stretched out, his chin sunk into his chest, and his fingertips pressed together in that familiar pose of intense introspection. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails played like a steady metronome against the backdrop of my own restless thoughts. For my part, I had been studying the photograph Lady Brackwell had provided. I had made a tracing of the figure, as Holmes had requested, and had spent the better part of an hour comparing it to the oil painting. Both featured the same door-weather-beaten oak iron hinges and an arched lintel carved with the Brackwell family crest. But while the photograph seemed harmless, even mundane, the painting chilled me in a way I could not articulate. The hand, pale and slender, seemed to reach toward the viewer, not in threat, but in need. Holmes had said little since we departed Baker Street, save for a single observation as we passed through the Midlands. There is no greater lie in a household than the locked door, which no one claims responsibility for. He had then fallen back into silence, though I noticed his eyes flicked often to the parcel containing the painting, stowed in the leather satchel beneath his seat. We arrived at the Greymere station just after midnight. A black carriage awaited us on the platform, its driver a burly man in a worn cap who introduced himself only as Peters. He offered no conversation during the drive, and Holmes, too, remained silent as we rattled through winding lanes bordered by stone walls and hedgerows that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Greymere Hall soon emerged from the mist like a dream poorly remembered. Chimneys jagged against the sky, its windows dark, and its turrets crowned with creeping ivy. Though its foundations were strong, the building bore an unmistakable weariness, as if it had grown tired of guarding its own secrets. Lady Brackwell greeted us at the front entrance, still fully dressed despite the hour, her expression composed but undeniably anxious. A single lamp burned in the grand foyer behind her, casting elongated shadows on the tiled floor. She gestured us in with a quiet urgency. "I've arranged 4 rooms in the east wing," she said. "I thought it best not to disturb the main quarters until morning. The staff has been instructed to prepare breakfast at 8. You'll find Greymere ... quiet at night." Holmes bowed politely. That is precisely when the loudest truths make themselves heard. She led us through a labyrinthine series of hallways, their wood-paneled walls adorned with oil portraits of Brackwell's long deceased. Several had faces so grim, I wondered whether their scowls had deepened with time. As we ascended the final staircase to our rooms, I could not shake the feeling that the house was listening. We passed the attic landing on our way. The door stood at the far end of a narrow corridor, flanked by faded tapestries and lit only by a single flickering sconce. Holmes paused. "That is the door from the painting, is it not?" Lady Brackwell hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it has not been opened in years. The key is lost." Holmes stepped closer and examined the door's frame, running a finger along the base where the wood had warped slightly. He sniffed the air, as if sensing something beyond human detection. "No scratch marks. No signs of forced entry," he murmured. "No dust disturbed along the jambs." "But you believe someone has been inside?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said, stepping back, "that this door is not as silent as it pretends to be." We retired shortly thereafter, though Holmes, as I expected, did not sleep. I awoke sometime around 3 in the morning to find him fully dressed, perched in an armchair by the fireplace, smoking in the dark. His eyes were trained on the ceiling, and I could just make out the glint of his pocket watch dangling from his fingers. "You hear it, don't you?" he said softly. I sat up, straining my ears. At first, there was only the wind, sighing softly through the gaps in the window frame. Then, unmistakably, a creak, followed by another, slow, deliberate, like footsteps across an old floorboard. Then, silence. "From the attic," I said. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Same as Lady Brackwell described. It's always between the hours of 3 and 4. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "do you suppose there is a physical explanation? Settling beams, or temperature changes perhaps?" "An excellent question, Watson," he replied. "Okay, and one I intend to answer definitively, though not tonight." Morning at Greymere Hall brought no sunlight, only a pale gray mist that pressed itself to the windows like an unwelcome guest. Over breakfast, Holmes questioned Lady Brackwell with his characteristic precision, though always under the guise of casual curiosity. "No recent visitors, Lady Brackwell?" "None. I've lived here alone since Percival's death, save for the servants. And they are all long-standing members of the household." She hesitated. "Most, yes. Though there is a new maid taken on 3 months ago. Quiet girl, keeps to herself." Holmes said, sipping his tea. "May I examine Sir Percival's study?" Lady Brackwell blinked. "If you wish, though I doubt you'll find anything." hasn't been touched since I had it closed. She led us to a heavy oak door on the ground floor, locked with an old brass key she retrieved from a drawer. The room within was spacious but austere, with high windows draped in velvet and a fireplace blackened with long disused ash. Single, large desks dominated the center, and above it, an imposing portrait of Sir Percival glared down at us with the same cold resolve I had seen in the hallway upstairs. Holmes wasted no time. He examined the fireplace grate, the underside of the desk, the picture frames, the bookshelves. He ran his hand along the wainscoting, then knelt to inspect a loose floorboard in the far corner. "Watson," he called, "help me lift this." We pried it up, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside lay an old cigar box, warped with age. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a set of keys, each old, rusted, and tagged with faded labels. One read, simply, "Attic door." Lady Brackwell gasped. "I had no idea, ... Holmes smiled faintly. People often go to great lengths to conceal the means of their own undoing. He handed the key to me. "We'll try this tonight, Watson. But first, we must pay a visit to the village. I have a notion that what is locked above has something to do with what was buried below." "Buried," I echoed. Holmes lit a cigarette and turned toward the window. "Indeed, for no man haunts his own attic unless someone else has hidden the body in the basement." Chapter 02. The next evening found us once again seated before the hearth in our modest guest chamber, kettle simmering on the iron trivet, and a stack of Holmes's hastily scribbled notes arranged on the side table beside him. Rain had begun to lash the windows in earnest by 7 o'clock, and the oppressive gloom outside gave the chamber the claustrophobic air of a ship's cabin. Holmes had spoken little since our return from the village, where he had made a series of quiet but pointed inquiries with the local vicar and the groundskeeper of St. Alred's cemetery. I had accompanied him, naturally, though he had divulged little of his reasoning, only that the dead occasionally leave better testimony than the living. Now, he paced the room in a slow, measured circuit, one hand in his pocket, the other toying with the ivory tip of his pipe. "I believe," he said at last, "that we are dealing not with a haunting, but with the carefully engineered illusion of one." I raised an eyebrow from my seat by the fire. "You're dismissing the noises in the attic, then?" "Not at all. In fact, I think they are quite real, but supernatural. No, they are meant to appear spectral, meant to sow unease in Lady Brackwell's mind. And that, Watson, is what troubles me most." I considered this in silence. "You suspect someone is trying to drive her mad?" Holmes turned, his silhouette illuminated by the fire. "Or, at the very least, to make her appear so. She is a wealthy widow with no immediate family, no heirs. Her control over the estate, both financially and reputationally, is absolute. Think someone wishes to unseat her. Think," he said, pausing to tamp fresh tobacco into his pipe, "that someone with access to this house has begun a campaign not of violence, but of doubt. And nothing is more corrosive in a place like Graymere Hall than the subtle suggestion that madness runs in the blood." He struck a match and leaned toward the flame. The sudden flare of light caught the lines of his face, calm, focused, utterly unreadable. "Consider," he went on between puffs, "the painting. A hand reaching from behind the attic door. Crude metaphor, yes, but a powerfully evocative one. It suggests captivity, something hidden, trying to escape. But to whom is that message directed?" "To Lady Brackwell," I replied at once. "She was the one who found it." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And where did she find it?" "On the stairs leading to the attic, place she had not visited in years, because it was locked." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet the painting appeared there, which means that someone unlocked the attic not to hide something, but to stage something." I exhaled slowly. It wasn't the attic that was meant to remain secret. It was the illusion that the attic was sealed. It's very good, Watson. And who, pray, might benefit from that illusion? I thought for a moment. You said Lady Brackwell has no close family. Correct. But she does have staff. Okay. One in particular caught my attention, Alice, the new maid. She's only been here 3 months, I said, recalling our earlier conversation. 3 months, Holmes repeated, and already entrusted with cleaning duties that take her into all corners of the house. Yet, Lady Brackwell, said she, seldom sees her. Curious? No. I leaned forward. Do you believe Alice placed the painting? Holmes's fingers tapped the stem of his pipe. Perhaps. But let us not forget the nature of theatrical illusion, Watson. The actor and the playwright are often different people. Alice may be the hand, but someone else is writing the script. At that moment, the fire gave a sudden crackle, and a burst of sap hissed in the flames. Holmes's eyes flicked to the window. We tried the attic tonight. No more waiting. The corridor leading to the attic was even more foreboding by lamplight. Shadows stretched long across the paneled walls, and every creak of the old floorboards seemed amplified in the silence. I carried the lamp while Holmes held the key, Hayes' other hand resting lightly on his walking stick, the one with the weighted handle, at the door. He paused and tilted his head. I followed his gaze, but saw only the flickering sconce. Smell that? He asked. I sniffed. A faint scent, metallic, musty. Old iron, I said. Rust, perhaps. He nodded. And mold. It's the kind you find in basements. Odd for an attic, don't you think? He inserted the key. It turned with a reluctant groan. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Dust floated like ash in the lamp's glow. The room was long and narrow, the floorboards warped, the ceiling sloped with the angle of the roof. At first glance, there was nothing unusual on these stacks of trunks, cobwebbed furniture, and discarded canvases propped along the walls. Holmes moved forward slowly, pausing before each object as though reading it. There, he said at last, gesturing to a broken easel in the corner. Oil paint, still damp, and brushes, see the bristles. Used recently. I bent beside him. Then the painting was done here. He crouched and picked up a small tin palette, and not by a professional guy. The strokes are heavy, the layering, impatient. T, this was not a portrait, was a message painted in haste. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Someone wanted Lady Brackwell to believe this house is haunted. But why? Why now? Could it be to distract her from something else? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Just so. And that brings us to the final piece of our little tableau. T strolled to the far end of the attic, where a large armoire stood with one door ajar. Inside were several moth-tin coats in a single box, newer than the rest. He opened it. Inside were letters, perhaps 30 in total, bound with twine. He untied them carefully and began to flip through the pages. I glanced over his shoulder. Most were signed only with the initials M.H. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer at first, only read faster, his eyes darting from line to line. At last, he looked up. This, he said, is not merely a campaign to unnerve Lady Brackwell. It is the prelude to a larger scheme, one that concerns her late husband and a truth she is not yet prepared to hear. What truth? Holmes closed the box. A Sir Percival Brackwell may not have died by accident after all. Morning dawned gray once more, but the rain had lifted, leaving Graymere Hall blanketed in a damp stillness that clung to the stone walls like a second skin. The fire in our sitting room crackled cheerfully, a weak defiance against the damp that settled in the bones. Holmes sat at the writing desk, spectacles perched low on his nose, meticulously copying excerpts from the bundle of letters we had discovered in the attic the night before. I had been rereading one particular letter dated February 2nd of the previous year over and over again. The writer, signed only as M.H., made cryptic references to debts repaid, matters buried at last in the final chapter of what we began in Manchester. The tone was neither affectionate nor overtly conspiratorial, but it was unmistakably familiar, as though written between equals who shared a grave understanding. "What do you make of them?" I asked, setting down my cup of tea. Holmes didn't look up. A correspondence between two men bound by secrecy, possibly blackmail, though I suspect the leverage ran both ways. "These are not love letters, Watson. They're relics of a hidden pact. And yet they were hidden in the attic, not burned or destroyed." Holmes tapped his pen thoughtfully. "That, Watson, is precisely what interests me most. Whoever concealed them did not wish to discard them. They wanted to retrieve them later, will perhaps use them at a more opportune time. But who is M.H.? Surely if we identify him, the whole matter begins to clarify." Holmes nodded slowly, finally removing his glasses and setting them aside. "The initials themselves are tantalizingly common. Half the county could have been christened with those letters. But there's something more telling." He selected one envelope and held it up to the window. "Note the seal. An embossed emblem, very faint but recognizable." I peered closely. A serpent coiled around a torch. "Indeed, that, Watson, is the crest of the Medical Guild of Manchester. I'll observe the writing style, restrained, clinical, almost antiseptic. Our Mr. M.H. was likely a physician or, at the very least, a man of scientific discipline." I stood, heart quickening slightly. "You think he treated Sir Percival?" "I think it's highly probable." Holmes turned and picked up a page from his earlier notes. "And if so, then the references in the letter, the burden we shared, the pain he no longer feels, begin to suggest not mere companionship, but complicity. I believe Sir Percival was ill, gravely so, and that M.H. was involved in his cure, his end." "You think Percival's death was arranged?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. "We are not yet in the realm of certainty. But consider, a locked attic, a series of hidden letters, and an inheritance that transfers cleanly with his death. The accident-tan, errant hunting shot is convenient, perhaps too convenient then." "We're dealing with a conspiracy," I said. "A conspiracy," Holmes echoed, "or a mercy. The distinction may not matter, at least not to the law, but it will matter to Lady Brackwell, Keith." At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was Peters, the carriage driver. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, removing his cap. "There's someone asking to see you. Says he's come from Manchester." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "What name?" "Didn't give one, sir. Said you'd recognize him." Holmes rose, his interest piqued. "Show him in." A moment later, a man stepped into the room, tall and slender, with a gray mustache and a gait that favored one leg. His coat was travel-stained, and his eyes pale blue and deeply set, scanned the room with caution before settling on Holmes. "I am Dr. Merrick Hartley," he said in a low voice. "You found my letters." Neither Holmes nor I spoke at first. Hartley moved to the window and stared out toward the wet gardens, the strain of his journey visible in the stoop of his shoulders. "I came because I heard that someone was asking questions about Graymere, about Sir Percival." "Told you?" Holmes asked. "No one directly, but word travels, Mr. Holmes. It always does when someone disturbs the dead." There was something unsettling in his tone, not a threat, but a kind of weary resignation. Holmes gestured for him to sit, which Hartley did, gingerly. "You were close with Sir Percival," Holmes said. "I was his physician, yes, but more than that, I was his confidant for many years. He was a proud man, not inclined to share weakness, but he trusted me. What weakness? Holmes asked softly. Hartley hesitated. Consumption. Advanced. Irreversible. He had, perhaps, 6 months left, maybe less. He was in pain daily, though he rarely let anyone see it. So, the hunting accident, I began, was no accident. Hartley finished. Silence settled thickly over the room. He asked me to help him, Hartley said. Not with treatment, but with ending it on his own terms. I refused at first, but as time passed, as the coughing worsened and his bones thinned and his eyes sank into his skull, I weakened. I helped him stage the incident, a remote part of the estate, a timed discharge mechanism in the rifle. By the time the others found him, the deed was done. Holmes folded his hands. And the letters. They were my guilt, Mr. Holmes. I wrote to him before and after his passing things. I never said aloud. I never meant for them to be found. And yet they were. Hartley nodded. Then it's begun, hasn't it? Someone's trying to twist the truth. Who? I asked. Who would do such a thing? I don't know, Hartley replied. But I've received anonymous letters in the last few weeks. Someone knows what I did. Then they want Lady Brackwell to believe that Percival's death was not suicide, but murder by her hand or mine. I cannot say. Holmes stood and moved to the fireplace, resting one arm on the mantel. Thank you, Doctor. That will be all for now. I may have further questions later. Hartley rose, clearly reluctant to go, but understanding the dismissal. As the door closed behind him, Holmes turned to me with an expression I had only seen once or twice in all our years together. Someone is playing a long and patient game. Watson, he said, they are sowing madness into Lady Brackwell's world, stitch by stitch, and they know the house well enough to do it undetected. I frowned. Alice. No, Holmes replied. She is a pauntiment, easily manipulated. Tage. But the mind. Behind this, it is clever, calculating, and close. Then who? He moved to the window and looked out into the garden, where the fog was beginning to creep back in. I don't know yet, but I intend to let them think I don't suspect them at all. He smiled faintly, and that, dear Watson, is when the trap begins to close. Chapter 03 IF. Holmes had drawn any firm conclusions from Dr. Hartley's confession. He kept them close to his chest. Over the next 2 days, he appeared oddly subdued. No sudden outbursts of deduction, Tage, no cryptic monologues, and not a single violin note drifting from his room. At meals, he listened more than he spoke, occasionally jotting notes in a small, black book, while Lady Brackwell poured tea with the poise of someone trained since childhood to conceal distress behind fine china. Despite the stasis, or perhaps because of it, the atmosphere at Gramier Hall had become palpably tense. Servants whispered in corners. Footsteps seemed to echo more loudly than usual, and Lady Brackwell, though dignified, had grown pale and thin-eyed. More than once, I saw her glance toward the staircase leading to the attic, only to quickly look away, as if fearing it might glance back. Holmes, for his part, maintained the illusion of idleness so perfectly that I, his closest companion, began to wonder if even he doubted the path forward. He spent long hours walking the gardens or examining bits of moss and soil scraped from the underside of the armoire we'd found in the attic, an act he described as merely satisfying a curious itch, though it struck me as nothing more than theatrical restlessness. That changed on the third morning. It began with a scream. I was in the drawing room with Lady Brackwell when it rang through the hallway, high-pitched, shrill, and filled with such unfiltered terror that I dropped my cup and was halfway to the source before it shattered on the carpet. Holmes, already in motion, appeared at the bottom of the servants' staircase just as Alice, the young maid, came tumbling down it, her apron stained and her eyes wide with fear. There was someone in my room, she sobbed, clinging to the banister. By the window it moved. I swear it. Holmes steadied her with a firm but gentle hand. Slowly now. What did you see? Alice shook her head, trembling. I don't know. Figure then, like a man in a long coat. I was making the bed, and I turned, and there he was. But when I screamed, he disappeared. Disappeared. I echoed. Through the wall, she whispered, eyes wide, like a ghost. Holmes turned to Lady Brackwell. No one else came upstairs. No, she said, pale as the maid. Everyone else was in the kitchen or laundry. No one would dare wander the guest quarters without permission. Holmes nodded and motioned for Alice to sit. Then he climbed the stairs alone, beckoning me to follow. Her room was small and plainly furnished, with a single window overlooking the rear gardens and a wardrobe set awkwardly into the wall beside it. Holmes shut the door behind us and locked it. Then, without a word, crossed the room and examined the wall Alice had indicated. This plaster is newer than the rest, he murmured. Note the difference in grain and the faint outline of a seam here. Pressed his fingers against the panel. With a soft click, the wall gave way slightly, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it too tight for an adult man to pass through, but large enough to serve as a conduit for sound or to house a lantern. Holmes reached into his coat, withdrew a small box of matches, and lit one. In the flickering light, we saw it, a small platform, just wide enough for someone to crouch, and on it, a discarded oil lamp, still faintly warm. Someone was here, he said, grimly, and recently. But why hide in a maid's room? To perpetuate the illusion, Holmes replied. Our spectral saboteur understands that fear spreads more efficiently through the lower ranks. Convince the staff there are ghosts, and soon even the lady of the house doubts her reason. So we stepped back into the hall. I couldn't help but glance behind us, half expecting the narrow panel to close on its own. Later that day, Holmes sent me into the village with instructions to post a telegram to Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard, asking for information regarding any individuals connected to Sir Percival Brackwell who might have returned from abroad in the last 6 months. When I asked why, Holmes simply replied, because not all ghosts are born in the grave, Watson. Some come back from exile. When I returned, I found Holmes in the study alone, pacing in the shadows, holding a small silver pendant between his fingers. Where did you find that? I asked. He turned it over. Near the estate's boundary wall, half buried in mud. I suspect it was lost in haste. It was delicate, oval-shaped, and bore a single initial engraved on the back. A. Alice. I guessed. Holmes shook his head. Unlikely. She wears no jewelry, and this piece is older. It's much older. I stared at the pendant, my mind spinning. Then who? Then who? Holmes turned and walked to the fireplace. Perhaps a child who never left, or someone who left as a child and has now returned. You're being maddeningly cryptic, as I must be, he said, till the web is fully spun. That night, we were invited by Lady Brackwell to dine in the main hall. The long table was lit by silver candelabras, and the storm outside raged against the windows, a fitting soundtrack to the unease permeating the house. Seated beside me was Mr. Clegg, the estate steward, an elderly man with a crooked gait and an expression that rarely shifted from weary neutrality. Across from him sat Mrs. Digby, the head housekeeper, whose face was so stiff with propriety that I had difficulty imagining her ever speaking. Above a whisper, it was during the second course that Holmes broke the tension. Tell me, Mr. Clegg, he said, quite suddenly, how long have you worked at Gramere Hall? 32 years, this spring, the steward replied, raising a graying brow. And in that time, have you ever known the attic to be used? Clegg hesitated. Not since the young master left. Holmes's fork paused midair. Young? Master, Sir Percival's younger brother, Ambrose. Bit of a scandal, really. He ran off to the continent when he was just 17. Never returned. Ambrose Holmes repeated thoughtfully. And what became of him? No one rightly knows, Clegg said. There were rumors of debts. Others said he joined some painters' commune in France. The family never spoke of him again. I turned toward Holmes, who gave no visible sign of reaction, yet I knew that beneath that still exterior, something had clicked into place. After dinner, Holmes excused himself early. I remained a moment longer to finish my drink, but I couldn't shake the strange look that had crossed Lady Brackwell's face when Ambrose's name was spoken. It wasn't fear, wasn't surprise, it was guilt. When I returned to our rooms, I found Holmes seated at the desk, a silver pendant beside him, and the letters from the attic spread out once more. We've been looking too closely at the surface, he said, without looking up. What we needed was a reflection. Of what? Of someone who was once here, he said, and now walks these halls as if they never left. Holmes had always said that the finest traps are not sprung with ropes or cages, but with silence and expectation. And on the fourth night at Graymere Hall, I saw him become that silence folded into it like a breath held long enough to draw the truth to the surface. The hall had grown quieter since Alice's outburst. The staff walked more briskly, the footsteps lighter, eyes lower. A thin layer of suspicion had settled over the estate like fine dust. Yet beneath that unease, a rhythm pulsed one only Holmes could hear. That morning, I found him on the east balcony, looking out over the sloping hedgerows and overgrown orchard where, I learned, Sir Percival's younger brother, Ambrose, had once sketched 4 hours in the rain. Holmes, always drawn to symmetry and the disruptions within it, studied that orchard like a battlefield. You believe he's returned? I said. Ambrose. Holmes didn't look at me. I believe someone wants Lady Brackwell to think so. Isn't that the same thing? Hardly. He turned now, his face illuminated by the morning mist. A lie pretends to be the truth. A ghost, Watson, pretends to be memory. I followed him back inside, past the old portraits and the locked cabinets in the east wing, until we reached the servants' corridor. Holmes paused at a corner where a loose panel had been repaired crudely, as if by someone in haste or unfamiliar with the house's craftsmanship. This was done recently, he said, and poorly. The intruder's route, but we've no evidence of Ambrose still living. No signature, no financial trail, only whispers. Holmes knelt and placed a small black object on the corridor floor, round lacquered disc, no larger than a coin. A faint red light pulsed at its center. What is that? I asked. A listener, he replied, borrowed from a rather clever engineer in Wapping. It detects sound movement, even breath, without capturing it. We'll place 3 more by nightfall. 1 behind the panel, 1 in Alice's room, and 1 just outside the attic door. To what end? To learn whether the ghost walks when no one is watching, or only when there's an audience. By dusk, the house had been seated. Holmes had moved through it like a surgeon, precise, quiet, unassuming. Lady Brackwell remained unaware, save for a private conversation with Holmes after dinner, during which she turned pale but nodded gravely. You've told her everything? I asked once we'd returned to our quarters. No, just enough. She need only be honest in one thing tonight, her fear. At exactly 3 minutes to midnight, Holmes dimmed our lantern and extinguished the fire. The room dropped into shadow, the only light coming from the hallway and the flicker of a candle in the far corridor that Lady Brackwell had agreed to leave lit in the attic stairwell. The rest of the household had retired. The house exhaled, settled, and then waited time. Passed slowly, could hear the gentle scratch of Holmes's pencil on a pad as he marked intervals. Every 15 minutes, he adjusted his pocket watch, tapped the casing of the detectors hidden throughout the hall, and nodded faintly. It was close to 1:30 when it began. a creak on the stair, faint, almost imagined. Holmes stiffened. Then, another sound, a door groaning open, not slammed, not rushed. Deliberate, measured, and then footsteps, slogged, descending the attic stair. Holmes stood, gesturing for me to follow, and we slipped silently into the corridor. Shadows danced along the walls. The candle Lady Brackwell had left flickered violently in its holder, and there at the top of the stairs stood a figure, tall, thin, dressed in a long coat that blended with the gloom. The face obscured beneath the brim of a low hat. One gloved hand on the banister, the other holding something we could not yet see. Lady Brackwell, peering at the far end of the hall in her dressing gown, gasped just as planned, and the figure turned toward her. "Ambrose," she whispered. The figure froze. Holmes stepped forward. "You've gone too far," he said, voice ringing with unexpected authority. The illusion was masterful. The painting, the noises, even the pendant. But ghosts don't leave fresh footprints on clean floors. The figure turned and bolted down the stairwell. Holmes dashed after him. I followed, heart pounding, as we raced through the twisting halls, down the side staircases and into the west wing until the figure vanished through a small door beneath the rear staircase, a servant's passage. We cornered him in the root cellar. Holmes struck a lantern to reveal the truth in the dim light. Ambrose Brackwell stood before us, gaunt, unshaven, and furious. "You should have stayed away," he spat. Holmes leveled his cane toward him. "But you couldn't, could you? Not with the house so close to yours again." The confession came an hour later in the study. Once Ambrose had been secured, and Lady Brackwell, pale and trembling, had been seated with a glass of brandy. He had returned 6 months prior, driven not by remorse, but by resentment. Years of exile in the gutters of Paris and the debtors' prisons of Lyon had twisted whatever fondness he once bore for his brother or this house. When he learned of Percival's death, he had come not in mourning, but in expectation. "I wrote to him," Ambrose said, "begged for help. I told him I was ill, dying. He never responded. When I returned, it was too late. He was already buried, and the house belonged to her." "You forged the painting," Holmes said. Ambrose sneered. "I painted better things when I was 17. That was the point, and I wanted it crude, primitive. A ghost scrawling for attention, and the noises. The letters you planted to stir madness." Ambrose said nothing. Holmes turned to Lady Brackwell. "He wanted you to question everything, to make the staff whisper, to make the estate impossible to maintain, so that in desperation you might step aside." Lady Brackwell said nothing, but I noticed she did not cry. Ambrose scowled. "She stole everything." "I was the younger son, yes, but he promised me." Holmes cut him off. "He promised you nothing but silence, and you repaid it with cowardice. You didn't return for love or redemption. You returned to haunt the house that no longer remembered you. Ambrose lunged, but the constable Holmes had summoned from the village restrained him easily later. As the sky lightened into a reluctant dawn, I stood with Holmes at the balcony, watching as the constable led Ambrose to the waiting carriage. Rain had begun again, soft and persistent. Holmes exhaled. It was never about a ghost, Watson. It was about a man who believed he had become one and tried to drag everyone else into the grave with him. Chapter 04. It was nearly dawn by the time Holmes returned to the drawing room, soaked to the bone from the early mist and still smelling faintly of the cellar's must. He had sent Ambrose Brackwell off with a constable just after 4, offering no words of parting. I found him now, seated in a high-backed chair, a blanket across his lap, cradling a cup of black tea that had long gone cold. The room was dim, but peaceful. The first shafts of morning light brushing the edge of the curtains. Holmes' gaze was fixed on the unlit hearth, his mind clearly turning over the final gears of deduction. I took the chair opposite him and waited. He spoke after a long pause. It was too dramatic, Watson. That's what troubled me from the very beginning. I blinked. What was? The painting? The noises? The pendant so conveniently found? Even the letters? One expects the supernatural to be subtle, elusive. But this haunting was operatic, staged for a specific audience. And yet, he leaned forward, now eyes bright, despite his exhaustion. Ambrose wasn't a master manipulator. He was bitter, unstable, and impulsive. He didn't orchestrate this entire thing. He walked into it. I sat upright. Then Ambrose wasn't the mastermind. He was a player, an actor in someone else's production. The key was his timing. He claimed he returned 6 months ago. Lady Brackwell's episodes, the strange sounds, only began 3 months ago. That's when she entered the house. I frowned. Alice? Holmes nodded. Precisely. Alice, or rather, Miss Alina Harcourt, the maid. She is no maid, Watson. She is a trained nurse and a former psychiatric aide in Manchester. I confirmed her background through Gregson yesterday after your telegram. Changed her name just before taking employment at Grammere. What struck me as odd was her placement. She had no prior domestic experience, yet she secured a position in one of the oldest estates in Kent. He stood, walked to the mantel, and picked up the pendant we had found earlier. This belonged to her mother. The engraving A was not for Alice, but for Amelia Harcourt, a woman who once worked as a governess here, dismissed under scandalous circumstances after becoming pregnant by none other than Sir Percival Brackwell. My mouth opened slightly. So this maid Alice, or Alina, was their daughter. Holmes gave a single nod. Illegitimate, forgotten, shamed, she was raised in a poorhouse in Manchester, while her father lived like a prince. When she discovered his name likely through hospital paperwork, during his final illness, she applied to Grammere under a false identity. It's timed perfectly to coincide with Lady Brackwell's widowhood. But what of Ambrose? I asked, struggling to piece the layers together. Surely they weren't working together. Oh no, Holmes said, eyes darkening. That was her greatest brilliance. She used him, found his letters perhaps stolen or purchased and planted them in the attic to stir the ghost story. Think she fed tales to the staff, spread subtle rumors about the haunted scares, and allowed her fear to be witnessed at just the right moments. He began to pace, growing more animated now. She needed a living, ghostly, shadowy figure to embody the whispers. So, when Ambrose returned, bitter and broken, she played the frightened maid. She stoked his resentment. It was she who unlocked the attic. She who set the trap he couldn't resist. Hey, when the moment came, she pushed him forward to take the fall. I was stunned. But to what end? Holmes stopped. Inheritance. Ambrose's appearance complicated the line of succession. Should Lady Brackwell have been declared unfit or deceased, the estate would have fallen to Ambrose. But if he were discredited or imprisoned, she would be the next legal heir. I finished, astonished. Percival's unacknowledged daughter. Holmes smiled grimly. Exactly. She needed Lady Brackwell to appear mad. She needed Ambrose to appear dangerous. She nearly succeeded on both fronts. But she said nothing to her, I recalled. Even after the confession, you said you didn't fully suspect her. I suspected, Holmes admitted, but I could not yet prove. That is, until this. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat and handed it to me. It was a page torn from a servant's ledger entries, scrawled in 2 different hands. One, Lady Brackwell's, noting repairs. The other, newer and curiously precise, noting the schedule of floor cleanings in the West Wing. What am I looking for? I asked. The ink, Holmes said. She left it, trying poorly. When exposed to moisture, it revealed hidden markings beneath the surface written in lemon juice, a childish trick. The message reads, "Final stage, tomorrow." He's ready. Proof of conspiracy. I breathed. An intent Holmes added. We left Graymere Hall just before noon, the sky still low and overcast. Lady Brackwell, having finally learned the truth of her husband's affairs and the child he'd abandoned, remained quietly in her room. I was told later that she had requested the Harcourt's family records be reopened and that her solicitors begin arrangements to investigate rightful claims to the estate with Holmes's findings submitted in confidence. As for Alina Harcourt, she was gone by the time the local constable arrived. Her belongings had vanished, and her bed had not been slept in. But Holmes had anticipated this. "I left a note for Gregson," he said as we boarded the train. "She tried to leave through Southampton, alone, probably under a new name. But she's clever, not wise. She won't disappear without checking whether her plan succeeded, and that he tapped the side of his temple will be her undoing." I was silent for a while, the countryside speeding past our window in a blur of green and gray. But then I said, "She didn't want wealth, did she?" "Not really. She wanted revenge." Holmes nodded. Recognition. The two often walk hand in hand, especially among the discarded. I turned toward him. "Do you pity her?" Holmes exhaled. "In a way. But justice is not softened by motive. She would have destroyed 2 lives and the legacy of a family for what she believed she deserved. That may earn understanding, but never absolution." We rode in silence for a time. Then, in that peculiar tone Holmes reserved for endings, he added, "You see, Watson, the most dangerous ghosts are not the ones we fear. They are the ones we forget till they return to remind us who they were." We returned to Baker Street undisguised that, while overcast, seemed somehow lighter than those that had followed us through Kent. Perhaps it was only the relief of the case resolved, or the contrast of the London streets bristling with noise and movement after the dead stillness of Graymere Hall. But I confess, felt as though a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual cheerful scolding, remarking on Holmes' damp boots and the state of his collar. She bustled off to warm suit and press fresh linen, and for a few precious minutes, silence settled in our sitting room once more. The fire crackled. The scent of pipe tobacco soon joined the faint whiff of rain on wool. Holmes had taken his usual place by the fireplace. Though he said little, I could sense a deeper satisfaction beneath the quiet, the sort of equilibrium he rarely found in the company of the living, but often achieved in the unraveling of their secrets. "I must admit," I began, pouring us both tea, "still find it difficult to understand how such a young woman could orchestrate such a cruel and elaborate deception." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Cruelty, my dear Watson, is rarely bound by age or gender. Nor is intelligence. Miss Harcourt, or Alina, if we used her proper name, had the misfortune of being born into betrayal. She merely returned the favor with interest. But to destroy her father's memory, to manipulate an unstable brother, and to nearly unhinge Lady Brackwell in the process, surely even you must find it monstrous." "Monstrous, yes," he agreed, "but entirely human." He leaned back, folding his hands beneath his chin, and thought. Consider her life. Born illegitimately, raised in obscurity, told nothing of her parentage until it suited the whims of a dying man. The very house she entered, Graymere, stood not only as a symbol of luxury denied, but of lies upheld by tradition. Every creaking stair and family portrait would have whispered, "You were never meant to be." She needed to matter, right? And when love was not offered, she reached for a legacy instead. I nodded slowly, reminded of the many people we'd encountered whose wounds were not visible but ran deeper than any blade. And Ambrose, I asked, what will become of him? He will be remanded to custody until a decision is made," Holmes replied. "Though I imagine, given the full circumstances, the court may offer leniency." He was a pawn willing, yes, but manipulated all the same. His letters were not merely bitter. Some, I suspect, were forged or revised. Miss Harcourt had ample time and motive to do so, I sighed. It seems no one emerged from that house untouched. Holmes gave me a sharp look. "You're wrong, am I?" "Yes." Lady Brackwell, for all her grief, gained something rare. Clarity. The truth. Clean wound is better than one festering in secrecy. In secrecy. Ambrose lunged, but the constable Holmes had summoned from the village restrained him easily later. As the sky lightened into a reluctant dawn, I stood with Holmes at the balcony, watching as the constable led Ambrose to the waiting carriage. Rain had begun again, soft and persistent. Holmes exhaled. It was never about a ghost, Watson. It was about a man who believed he had become one and tried to drag everyone else into the grave with him. Chapter 04. It was nearly dawn by the time Holmes returned to the drawing room, soaked to the bone from the early mist and still smelling faintly of the cellar's must. He had sent Ambrose Brackwell off with a constable just after 4, offering no words of parting. I found him now seated in a high-backed chair, a blanket across his lap, cradling a cup of black tea that had long gone cold. The room was dim but peaceful, its first shafts of morning light brushing the edge of the curtains. Holmes' gaze was fixed on the unlit hearth, his mind clearly turning over the final gears of deduction. I took the chair opposite him and waited. He spoke after a long pause. "It was too dramatic, Watson. That's what troubled me from the very beginning." I blinked. What was? The painting, the noises, pendant so conveniently found, even the letters. Expects the supernatural to be subtle, elusive. But this haunting was operatic, staged for a specific audience. And yet, he leaned forward now, eyes bright. Despite his exhaustion, Ambrose wasn't a master manipulator. He was bitter, unstable, and impulsive. He didn't orchestrate this entire thing. He walked into it. I sat upright. Then Ambrose wasn't the mastermind. He was a player, an actor in someone else's production. The key was his timing. He claimed he returned 6 months ago. Lady Brackwell's episodes, the footsteps, the strange sounds, only began 3 months ago. That's when she entered the house. I frowned. Alice Holmes nodded. Precisely. Alice, or rather, Miss Alina Harcourt, the maid. She is no maid, Watson. She is a trained nurse aunt, a former psychiatric aide in Manchester. I confirmed her background through Gregson yesterday after your telegram. Changed her name just before taking employment at Graymere. What struck me as odd was her placement. She had no prior domestic experience, and yet she secured a position in one of the oldest estates in Kent. He stood, walked to the mantel, and picked up the pendant we had found earlier. This belonged to her mother. He was not for Alice, but for Amelia Harcourt, a woman who once worked as a governess here, dismissed under scandalous circumstances after becoming pregnant by none other than Sir Percival Brackwell. My mouth opened slightly. So this Madalys, or Alina, was their daughter. Holmes gave a single nod. Legitimate, forgotten, shamed. She was raised in a poorhouse in Manchester, while her father lived like a prince. When she discovered his name, likely through hospital paperwork. During his final illness, she applied to Graymere under a false identity, timed perfectly to coincide with Lady Brackwell's widowhood. But what of Ambrose? I asked, struggling to piece the layers together. Surely they weren't working together. "Oh no," Holmes said, eyes darkening. That was her greatest brilliance. She used him, found his letters perhaps stolen or purchased and planted them in the attic to stir the ghost story. Then she fed tales to the staff, spread subtle rumors about the haunted stairs, and allowed her fear to be witnessed at just the right moments. He began to pace, growing more animated now. She needed a living, ghostly, shadowy figure to embody the whispers. So when Ambrose returned, bitter and broken, she played the frightened maid. She stoked his resentment. It was she who unlocked the attic. She who set the trap he couldn't resist. And when the moment came, she pushed him forward to take the fall. I was stunned. But to what end? Holmes stopped. Inheritance. Ambrose's appearance complicated the line of succession. Should Lady Brackwell have been declared unfit or deceased, the estate would have fallen to Ambrose. But if he were discredited or imprisoned, she would be the next legal heir. I finished, astonished. Percival's unacknowledged daughter. Holmes smiled grimly. Exactly. She needed Lady Brackwell to appear mad. She needed Ambrose to appear dangerous. She nearly succeeded on both fronts. But you said nothing to her, I recalled. Even after the confession, you said you didn't fully suspect her. I suspected, Holmes admitted, but I could not yet prove. That is, until this. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat and handed it to me. It was a page torn from a servant's legend trees, scrawled in 2 different hands. One, Lady Brackwell's, noting repairs. The other, newer and curiously precise, noting the schedule of floor cleanings. In the West Wing. What am I looking for? Asked. The ink, Holmes said. She left it drying poorly. When exposed to moisture, it revealed hidden markings beneath the surface written in lemon juice. A childish trick. The message reads, "Final stage, tomorrow. It's ready." Proof of conspiracy, I breathed. In intent, Holmes added. We left Graymere Hall just before noon, the sky still low and overcast. Lady Brackwell, having finally learned the truth of her husband's affairs and the child he'd abandoned, remained quietly in her room. I was told later that she had requested the Harcourt's family records be reopened and that her solicitors began arrangements to investigate rightful claims to the estate with Holmes's findings submitted in confidence. As for Alina Harcourt, she was gone by the time the local constable arrived. Her belongings had vanished and her bed had not been slept in. But Holmes had anticipated this. I left a note for Gregson, he said as we boarded the train. She tried to leave through Southampton. It's alone, probably under a new name. But she's clever, not wise. She won't disappear without checking whether her plan succeeded. And that, he tapped the side of his temple, will be her undoing. I was silent for a while, the countryside speeding past our window in a blur of green and gray. Then I said, she didn't want wealth, did she? Not really. She wanted revenge. Holmes nodded. Kenya, in recognition. Kenya. The two often walk hand in hand, especially among the discarded. I turned toward him. Do you pity her? Holmes exhaled. In a way, but justice is not softened by motive. She would have destroyed 2 lives and the legacy of a family for what she believed she deserved. That may earn understanding, but never absolution. We rode in silence for a time. Then, in that peculiar tone Holmes reserved for endings, he added, You see, Watson, the most dangerous ghosts are not the ones we fear. They are the ones we forget till they return to remind us who they were. We returned to Baker Street under skies that, while overcast, seemed somehow lighter than those that had followed us through Kent. Perhaps it was only the relief of the case resolved, or the contrast of the London streets bristling with noise and movement after the dead stillness of Grammere Hall. But I confess, I felt as though a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual cheerful scolding, remarking on Holmes' damp boots and the state of his collar. She bustled off to warm soup and press fresh linen, and for a few precious minutes, silence settled in our sitting room once more. The fire crackled. The scent of pipe tobacco soon joined the faint whiff of rain on wool dot. Holmes had taken his usual place by the fireplace. Though he said little, I could sense a deeper satisfaction beneath the quiet sort of equilibrium he rarely found in the company of the living, but often achieved in the unraveling of their secrets. I must admit, Bea pouring us both tea, I still find it difficult to understand how such a young woman could orchestrate such a cruel and elaborate deception. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Cruelty, my dear Watson, is rarely bound by age or gender, nor is intelligence. Miss Harcourt Alina, if we use her proper name, had the misfortune of being born into betrayal. She merely returned the favor with interest, but to destroy her father's memory, to manipulate an unstable brother, and to nearly unhinge Lady Brackwell in the process. Surely even you must find it monstrous. Monstrous, yes, he agreed, but entirely human. He leaned back, folding his hands beneath his chin in thought. Consider her life. Born illegitimately, raised in obscurity, told nothing of her parentage until it suited the whims of a dying man. The very house she entered Graymere's did not only as a symbol of luxury denied, but of lies upheld by tradition. Every creaking stair and family portrait would have whispered, "You were never meant to be." She needed to matter, till when love was not offered, she reached for legacy instead. I nodded slowly, reminded of the many people we'd encountered whose wounds were not visible, but ran deeper than any blade. And Ambrose, I asked, what would become of him? Will be remanded to custody until a decision is made, Holmes replied. Though I imagine, given the full circumstances, the court may offer leniency. He was a pawn willing, yes, but manipulated all the same. His letters were not merely bitter. Some, I suspect, were forged or revised. Miss Harcourt had ample time and motive to do so. I sighed. It seems no one emerged from that house untouched. Holmes gave me a sharp look. You're wrong. Am I? Yes. Lady Brackwell, for all her grief, gained something rare. Clarity. The truth. A clean wound is better than one festering in secrecy. It was not the brilliance of the case that made it linger in my mind. It was the cost of uncovering it, and perhaps, in that, lay the true inspiration behind Sherlock Holmes' most iconic cases. Not the puzzles solved, but the souls exposed in the solving. It was almost a full year after the resolution at Graymere Hall when I found myself once more journeying southward through the Kent countryside. An invitation had arrived, addressed in Lady Brackwell's distinctive, sweeping hand, and sealed with the now familiar crest. She wrote with the same mixture of formal elegance and quiet sincerity I had come to respect in her, requesting that I visit the estate not for any medical concern, but for something she called a matter of sentiment. Holmes declined to join me, citing an involvement with a perplexing forgery in Belgravia that he assured me involved the most devilishly articulate parrot I've ever encountered. I rather suspected his absence was intentional. Holmes was not one for revisiting the past unless the past insisted. Quagmire to him had yielded its secrets. It no longer whispered. For me, however, the journey held weight. When the carriage arrived at the edge of a long gravel path leading up to Graymere Hall, I felt a tremor of familiarity. The rows of skeletal hedges, the ancient weather vane atop, the eastern turret, the trees that always seemed one gust away from shedding their final leaves. And yet, something was different. The grounds had been trimmed. Ivy no longer strangled the southern wall. The window panes gleamed. Graymere no longer looked haunted. Lady Brackwell greeted me at the door herself, dressed in a modest shade of violet and with her hair pinned simply. She looked, if not younger, then certainly more solid, less like a woman pressed upon by shadows and secrets. Dr. Watson, she said warmly, taking my hands in hers. You've no idea how pleased I am you came. And I'm honored to return, Lady Brackwell, I replied. So I confess, I was curious at your letter. You said it wasn't urgent, yet here I am. She smiled, and gestured me inside. There is something you must see. Something I couldn't trust to mere description. She led me not to the drawing room, but to the old attic stairwell, the very one where so much fear and misdirection had once unfolded. The candle was gone, and the banister had been repolished. We ascended in silence. And I realized I hadn't returned to this space since the night of Ambrose's capture. The attic had been transformed, gone were the dusty trunks and cobweb-laced corners. In their place stood a gallery of quiet, curated space lined with paintings, letters, and a few aged objects under glass. At the center of it all stood a single large canvas, a portrait of Elena Harcourt. She was depicted not in grandeur or Victorian affectation, but as she had truly been, a slender figure in a modest dress, a satchel in her lap, her expression guarded, unreadable. Her eyes looked out from the painting, not with menace, but with profound isolation. I commissioned it 6 months ago, Lady Brackwell said beside me, from a portraitist in Dover. He works in what he calls emotional realism. I wanted something honest. I stared at the canvas. It's uncanny, I whispered. She looks human. Lady Brackwell finished for me. Not a villain, not a victim, just a woman shaped by pain. She moved to a small pedestal nearby and lifted a velvet cloth from its top. Beneath it lay the old pendant, the one that had started our spiral into ghost stories and generational wounds. It was encased in glass, open, with both initials visible, A, H, and a B. I had it altered, she said. One for her mother, one for me. I wanted the family she never had to be preserved, even if only in symbol. I was silent, humbled by the grace with which she had chosen to remember a nearly disastrous past. I've had no contact from her, she continued. No letters, no messages from abroad. Holmes said she may be in Switzerland. I nodded. He believes she is receiving care. Lady Brackwell nodded faintly. Then let that be enough. After a pause, she turned to me. You see now, Dr. Watson, why I asked you here. I wished for someone else to witness what this house has become, not out of pride, but to prove that truth needn't poison the walls. We descended together and returned to the parlor, where tea had been laid out by a maid I did not recognize, a younger girl with shy eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she poured. Lady Brackwell noticed too. That's Marian, she said, softly. She lost both her parents last year to illness. I offered her a place here, a chance to begin again. The cycle must break somewhere. Later that evening, before I departed, I stood again on the front steps. The lanterns were lit, and a soft wind moved across the grass like a sigh. I think Holmes would be moved by what you've done, I told her. She gave a dry smile. He might simply observe that the equilibrium has been restored. I laughed. True, but I suspect, deep down, he believes in redemption, even if he never says so. She looked back at the house. Redemption is not found in the apology. It's found in what you choose to remember and what you choose to preserve. On the return train, I opened my notebook once more. I had planned to write another entry on the Brackwell affair, but stories, as Holmes often reminded me, are not governed by outlines or chapters. They move like people, backward and forward, doubling over themselves, sometimes ending not with exclamation, but with stillness. It is not the ghost that lingers after a haunting, I wrote, but the silence that follows its departure. In that silence, Graymere Hall has found its peace, and so, perhaps, I have those who once dwelt there in resentment, sorrow, and longing. The countryside slipped past the window like a ribbon unwinding, and behind me, the ghosts of Graymere Hall fell finally into rest. Chapter 06, A Shadow of His Own, as narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. It was well into the second week of October when I found Holmes in one of his most peculiar moods, a combination of abstraction and strange quiet. The kind that made him insufferable at breakfast, yet startlingly poetic at dusk. The leaves outside 221B Baker Street had turned rust and amber, littering the stoop like the discarded notes of an autumn symphony. Inside, however, the air was still, and something unspoken weighed upon him. I recognized the signs. There had been no case for several days. The usual morning correspondence, normally scattered across our side table like confetti, remained unopened. The violin was untouched, its bow resting like a forgotten sword atop its velvet-lined case. It was just after supper that he finally spoke. "You never asked me why I insisted you record the Brackwell affair," he said. I looked up from my journal, where I had been drafting an account of our recent encounter with the Bishopsgate forger. "I assumed it was for posterity," I replied. "You always say your lesser-known cases often reveal more of the human spirit than the headline crimes." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Partly, but in truth, it reminded me of something else, a case I never solved." I set the journal aside. "Would you care to tell me?" He hesitated, a rare moment for Holmes, who never shied from narrative when it served a lesson. "Before I met you," he began, "I was called, briefly, to the North Lancashire. A wealthy man had taken ill and strange happenings surrounded his estate. Odd footprints, missing objects, doors found open in the night. You know the sort. The local magistrate suspected vagrants. The housekeeper whispered of hauntings." He rose, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the window, staring into the misty blur of Baker Street. "But there was a daughter legitimate, unacknowledged, and recently discovered by the dying patriarch. Her name was Lillian Mercer. She worked as a schoolteacher, plain and intelligent. When I met her, she denied any interest in her father's estate. Said she had only come to witness the apology." He paused, but things began to go wrong. The patriarch grew more paranoid. The younger sons believed she meant to manipulate the will. One night, a fire broke out in the East Wing. The father died 2 days later, and the will vanished entirely. No charges were filed. There was no proof of foul play. "And you?" I asked quietly. "I left. I could prove nothing. I had suspicions many, but I had no pendant, no secret ink, no confession tucked behind a ledger." Holmes returned to the chair and sat. For a moment, he seemed less the brilliant detective and more the man flawed, haunted by a ghost of his own. Years later, I learned Lillian Mercer had died penniless in a tenement outside Manchester. The sons inherited everything. Right. The story was forgotten. He looked at me now, not with his usual still gaze, but something softer. "Watson, the Brackwell case was my redemption. Not for her, but for myself. When I saw Alina Harcourt, I saw Lillian. Different women, yes, but both shaped by secrets they did not choose, cast aside by men whose names they could never bear in public. In solving Alina's case, I recovered something I had long misplaced, the certainty that, sometimes, even the forgotten deserve justice." I sat quietly, absorbing his words. In all our years, I had never known Holmes to admit failure, let alone the emotional consequence of it. He was always too focused on the next clue, the next observation. But this was different. "You did solve it, Holmes," I said gently, "even if not the one in Lancashire." He gave a thin smile. "Perhaps, though sometimes I wonder, if justice delayed becomes justice denied." Relapsed into a comfortable silence, the kind shared by old friends who have weathered both storms and long winters of the soul. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past in the fog. "Will you write it down?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Write what?" "This. Tonight. What I've just told you. The unwritten case." I reached for my journal. "Under what name?" He looked toward the hearth, where the firelight danced like memory. "Call it the case that was never filed." "Okay." That night, I wrote long, past midnight. The words flowed not in the crisp cadence of a case report, but with the deeper rhythms of confession, regret, and redemption. I did not record it as one of Holmes' solved triumphs. I recorded it as a man's long echo answered, finally, by another. Even the great detective, I wrote, carries the weight of unsolved rooms. And perhaps it is not the solving of all mysteries that grants peace, but the knowledge that we tried fully, honestly, and without turning away from the shadows that look like our own. When I looked up from the page, Holmes was asleep in his chair, head tilted just slightly, the old glass violin glinting in the corner like a specter stilled. I did not wake him. Some ghosts are better left sleeping. It is a peculiar thing to watch the world change while one's closest companion remains seemingly immutable. Yet, even the most rigid towers weather, and in Holmes, I had begun to notice something subtle, not a crumbling, but a deepening. He had grown quieter in the weeks following our late-night conversation about Lillian Mercer, less clipped in speech, more inclined to stare at the fire rather than leap from his chair to deduce the source of mud on a constable's cuff. Some men age visibly, others, with their passing years, like a series of ghosts only they can see. Holmes, I believe, had begun to walk among his. One morning in early November, returned from our rounds to find him not in the sitting room, but in the smaller chamber off the back of our flat, the one he rarely entered, filled with notebooks and unsorted monographs. He stood before a wall cluttered with what could only be described as a chaos of strings, photographs, and newsprint clippings. I had not seen such an arrangement since the Moriarty affair, but this was no pursuit of a living foe. The center of the wall bore no face, no map, no code, only a name penned in Holmes' precise hand. Lillian Mercer Holmes, I asked cautiously, setting my bag down. Are you reopening the case? He didn't turn to face me. Not exactly. A step closer, observing the disparate threads, many from over a decade past. Property records, court depositions, a blurred sketch of the Lancashire estate, even a recipe for a type of flour-based ink said to vanish when exposed to lime water. I thought you said this case was unsolvable. I did. Can it remain so? He replied evenly. But something compels me to understand it fully, not for the sake of justice, but for myself. Guilt, I asked. Reflection, he answered, though the distinction may be semantic. He finally turned then, his face more gaunt in the morning light than I remembered, and yet his eyes still burned with the mind that had made Scotland Yard both envy and dependent upon him. You must understand, Watson, he continued, I do not fear failure. It is inevitable, even instructional. What I fear, what I have always feared, is misunderstanding, the misjudging of character. The reading of a man or woman is one thing when they are quite another. Do you believe you misread her? Holmes was silent for a long time. Then I believe I saw only what the case required. And now, years later, I wonder what I did. Not allow myself to see. There are few moments in my life when I felt Holmes needed me, not as chronicler nor doctor, but simply as a man beside him. This was one. You were young then, I offered, less experienced, till perhaps less attuned to the subtleties of suffering. He gave a faint laugh. Is that what I've become, Watson? A connoisseur of sorrow? No, I said gently, but perhaps you've become something better, a man who understands that intelligence is not the same as wisdom. Kay. He said nothing more, but reached up to pin one last clipping to the wall. It was from a women's charity in Manchester, an obituary for a nurse who had used a false name and left behind no known family. The picture was unclear, but there was something unmistakable in the shape of the jaw, the eyes that looked past the camera as if listening to something none of us could hear. Do you think that was her? I asked. I cannot prove it, he murmured, but I feel it, Kay. And my feelings, while not admissible in court, are often correct in life. The following days were a return to our rhythm, though laced now with something quieter. Holmes resumed. Cases, mall thefts, missing manuscripts, a counterfeit ring in Limehouse. But he carried himself differently, as though he had finally accepted that not all conclusions arrive with certainty, nor all puzzles with clean solutions. One evening, as we sat by the hearth reviewing a letter from Inspector Lestrade about a string of pawnbroker burglaries, Holmes turned to me and said, "Watson, do you believe a man can be haunted by the lives he did not save?" The question was not rhetorical. He truly sought the answer. "I think," I replied slowly, "that any man worth admiring is." He nodded, and in his eyes I saw both agreement and relief. That night, I returned to my journal. I did not write of pawnbrokers or police. I wrote of Lillian Mercer, of Holmes' long-delayed reckoning, of the difference between intellect and empathy. And I ended with the following: the greatest detective of our age was never a machine. He was a man who, having unraveled the darkest knots of human deception, finally turned inward and sought to untie the one string he had always left tangled his own capacity for regret. The fire burned low. The case was closed, but the man Sherlock Holmes was still very much unfolding. Chapter 07. It was a Thursday evening in late November when I found myself walking alone down the quiet slope of Upper Wimpole Street, coat collar turned high against the frost. London had grown colder since the clocks fell back, and with the night settling in by tea, the city assumed its more secretive shape, less hurried and more contemplative, as though every gaslight flicker was a sigh withheld. I had left Holmes behind at Baker Street with his pipe, his dispatches from Lestrade, and a peculiar silence I had come to recognize. It was the silence, not of idleness, but of retreat and inward folding that signaled Holmes was thinking in a way I could not access that came upon him. There was little use trying to engage. He did not so much ignore company as dissolve into abstraction. The Lillian Mercer casseur, more aptly. The shadow of its memory still hung in the corners of our flat, like an unspoken guest. Holmes never spoke of it again directly, yet I would catch him rereading the same note, or lingering over a particular photograph with a look I could not interpret. And so I walked that evening to clear my own thoughts, carrying with me the weight of friendship with a man brilliant beyond imagining, yet deeply, almost tragically, human. As I reached the corner of Marylebone Lane, I passed a newsboy hawking evening editions, shouting something about a body discovered in the Thames. I purchased a copy without thinking, more out of habit than intention. The article, buried beneath parliamentary debates and stock figures, was brief, unidentified. Woman found in Limehouse Reach. No signs of violence. Possessions water damaged. Authorities suspect suicide. There was no name, no photograph. Just the emptiest kind of conclusion, one lacking inquiry, lacking story. I folded the paper and continued on. Upon my return to Baker Street, I found Holmes precisely where I had left him, seated, cross-legged, pipe in hand, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the hearth. But something in the angle of his brow struck me as heavier. "You've seen it," he said, without looking. "Seen what?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The Limehouse woman." I said nothing, placing the newspaper silently on the table beside him. He didn't move. "I've made inquiries already," he continued, after a long moment. "Constable on duty reported finding no identification, only a scrap of linen embroidered with the letters L.M. I sat down across from him, my chest tightening. "You don't believe it was her?" said. "I don't know," he replied. "And that is the problem, Watson. Not knowing truly, not knowing has become more intolerable to me than being wrong." The words hung in the air like smoke. "You once said," I began carefully, "that the world is full of cases that go unresolved, that justice is an ideal, not a guarantee." Holmes looked up now, eyes sharp but weary. Yes, and I said that when I was younger, when my belief in intellect was still enough to soothe every failure. He rose and crossed to the window, parting the curtain just slightly. Outside, the street lamp's halo glowed faintly through the haze. Somewhere, a coach clattered past, its wheels echoing like hollow footsteps on marble. I thought, Holmes continued, that solving the Brackwell affair would grant closure not to them, but to me. But I see now that memory is not so tidy. Some questions do not vanish with the verdict. They rot at the root until everything begins to lean. I had never heard him speak so plainly of weariness, not after Reichenbach, not even after Irene. Adler, you've carried this too long, I said gently. And if I let it go? He asked, still at the window. If I forget her name, her face, the sound of her voice when she said, I have come to witness the apology, do I become less of a man or merely more of a machine? I could not answer him. The fire cracked softly behind us. Holmes turned back toward me and approached the shelves where our older case files were kept. He withdrew a slim, leather-bound volume 1 I did not recognize by its spine. Before you arrived, he said, opening it to a bookmarked page. I recorded my deductions about the Mercer affair. Not for publication, not even for your archives, for myself. He handed the volume to me. Its pages were filled with sketches, timelines, hypotheses. But beneath the notations, I noticed something rare. Marginalia, not in Holmes' precise hand, but more erratic, crossed out, redrafted. Occasional moments of raw speculation. Occasional moments of raw speculation. Not fact, not logic, emotion. I looked up. You see, he said quietly, even the most logical of men must, at some point, confront the border between the measurable and the meaningful. There was a long silence after that. We sat once more by the fire. Outside, the fog thickened, cloaking London in its usual veil of half-truths and echoes. But inside, something had shifted. Not resolved, but revealed. I wrote that night in my journal. For all the cases we solved, it is the ones we could not close that haunted Holmes the most. The ones that left a thread dangling in its perfect weave. In the end, I believe he feared not the unsolvable mystery, but the unspoken truth it forced him to live with. That deduction may bring justice, but only memory brings understanding. Later, as the candles burned low and Holmes once again turned to his violin for performance, but for solace I realized that our greatest mysteries are not found in the crime scenes of England, but in the quiet quarters of the heart. Some cases you solve, others you carry. There is a small drawer in my study in old cedar slot, tucked beneath more respectable volumes and files where I keep things that do not belong in the record books. Not cases, not crimes, not even clear memories. Just fragments, slips of paper, ink-stained musings in Holmes' spidery hand. A photograph with a name scrawled across the back that no one else would recognize. A railway ticket to Manchester. The burned edge of a letter that once bore the initials LMI. Do not place them there to forget. Quite the opposite. Keep them in the dark to ensure I never mistake them for fiction. These remnants are too complicated, too unpolished to ever grace the public pages of the Strand. They are not stories. They are scars. And they remind me, in their silence, of the man who taught me to read the world by observing what others ignored. It has now been 3 months since the Limehouse discovery. Then, though no definitive identification was ever made, Holmes quietly added the report to his private archive, folded with surprising care into the Lillian Mercer file. He spoke no words when he did it, only exhaled, as if the act of placing the paper down marked a punctuation knot. In fact, but in grief, I believe that was his way of burying her in the time since. Holmes has resumed his more visible activities. I have seen him animated again examining forged letters in Whitehall, lecturing the College of Surgeons on blood-stained patterns, even tracking a stolen Fabergé box across 3 counties with that unmistakable blend of brilliance and disdain. But something inside him has changed, Kay, and I no longer require a physician's eye to see it. He listens more now. He interrupts less. And when he speaks of motive, Kay, there's a pause just before his conclusion, as if weighing not only the act, but the ache behind it. It was on one such winter evening, quiet, Kay, and full of smoke, that Holmes stood by the hearth and said, quite without preamble, "Do you know what I have never confessed, Watson?" I looked up from my book, Caven. "How little you've confessed at all. I suspect the list is long." He smiled faintly. "Fair. But this particular secret, this one lingers more than most." I waited. Holmes was not a man who dropped threads without intent. "It is this," he said, "that in all the years we worked together, I never once thought of my mind as a gift." This startled me, Holmes. "Surely, no," he said, raising a hand gently. "It was always a tool, a blade, a compass, a kind of crowbar for lifting the lids off hidden things. But not a gift, because gifts bring joy, and my mind has brought me only clarity. And clarity, Watson, can be the cruelest sort of mirror." He turned toward the fire, where his silhouette flickered like a ghost confined to flesh. "I have peered through so many masks," he continued. "I've read men like newspapers, women like telegrams, every comma of deception revealed in posture or breath. But never once did I truly understand what it cost them to live those lies." He looked over at me, the light catching just the edge of his expression. "It took Mercer to teach me that." I rose, poured him a brandy, and sat beside him. "She did not defeat you," I said quietly. "No," he agreed, quite. "But she evaded me in the only way that matters, by becoming, in the end, not a suspect or a cipher, but a person I could not dissect without mourning." There was a long pause, and then Holmes, who so rarely veered into sentiment, tatted almost to himself. "She asked only to be seen, not solved." That night, as the fire turned to cinders and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed faintly in the flat below, I did what I had done so many times before. I recorded it. Not the words, but the essence. The final thread in a tapestry that had begun with whispers in Graymere Hall and ended not with arrest or acclaim, but with a quiet shift in the soul of a man too often mistaken for stone. I wrote, "Perhaps it is not the truth we seek, but the permission to carry it." K. In the long ledger of Holmes' cases, the Brackwell affair may seem a footnote, K, but in the private volumes of his heart and mind it stands as one of the only entries written not in ink, but in ash. In the years that followed, I would return to that drawer now and again, not to reopen wounds, but to remember what cannot be printed or archived, that the greatest minds, too, are shaped by sorrow. And Holmes, though he will deny it, deflect it, and even laugh at the suggestion, was, in the end, not only the sharpest man I ever knew, but the most human.